5.
Hey, what's going on? This is your boy 5-Piece, producer and engineer extraordinaire. Are you an artist, producer, engineer, or music professional that's looking for funding for your music career? Could you benefit from having funding for studio time, mixing and mastering, or even marketing costs? I think I have something for you. I've written a free ebook. It's 9 pages, super short and digestible, where I break down the 6 main places that artists and professionals like yourself can find funding for their musical projects. If this sounds like it's of value to you, please click the link below and you can download this for free today and benefit from this knowledge. I hope this helps. I'll see you guys soon. Peace.
Five.
What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? This is your boy 5-Piece, producer and engineer extraordinaire. Thanks for checking out this video, and if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe and the bell button below to stay tuned for more tutorials in the future. By popular request, I've decided to do this video on streaming services and how to optimize your mixes for them to translate onto these platforms. Every platform is a little bit different. They all have their own criteria that they use to basically optimize your songs when they hit things like Spotify, Apple Music, and more. I wanted to talk about this in this lesson, so let's jump into Pro Tools and I'll show you what's going on. So you want to make sure that your song is going to translate onto Spotify, Apple Music, and all the popular streaming services that a lot of people are using today to consume music. Now, each of these services has their own specific way of normalizing the audio and basically handling it so that they deliver a consistent experience when somebody is listening to their service. So, for example, if somebody's listening to Spotify and they're listening to, let's say, a Rihanna song, and then your song comes on, and then a Drake song comes on after yours, all these songs will basically be the same in volume, and there won't be a noticeable difference. And Spotify and all these services want to create a consistent listening experience, so that way the listener doesn't have to constantly be reaching for the volume button on their device. Now, before we even talk about this, it's important to understand what these services are using to measure loudness, and that specifically is known as LUFS. LUFS stands for Loudness Units Relative to Full Scale, and it's basically the most accurate way to measure the loudness of audio. Now, typically, we've been using other ways to measure loudness of audio, such as peak volume and RMS, but LUFS is really taking over here, and this is the loudness system that all of these services rely on when they're going to be encoding volume and encoding the song that you're submitting to their platform. Now, a lot of services have a similar loudness curve, and the one to really pay attention to is Spotify. Spotify is arguably one of the biggest organizations there is, the biggest streaming platform there is, I should say, and they stream their audio around -14 LUFS. So if a track, let's say, has a volume of -8 LUFS, Spotify will take that song and then turn it down to -14. Now, if a track is quieter than -14, let's say maybe it's hitting -24, Spotify is going to take that volume and increase it to -14 LUFS. So they're really, rewarding dynamic mixes and making sure that things are going to translate correctly. And if you're mixing really, really loud, there's a potential that your mix may not translate as well when it hits these streaming platforms, and vice versa. So you really want to be mindful of how you're mixing your songs and ultimately what level, what LUFS you're achieving in order to understand what it's going to sound like when it hits that platform. So this is kind of good, right? It encourages artists to basically create more dynamic music, right? Same with mixers, producers. It's really encouraging everybody to make more dynamic mixes, right? But the tricky part is you don't want to just mix for these platforms, because at the same time, you might be handing mixes over to, let's say, DJs and radio and different platforms that may not fare as well if you have a mix that's just sitting at -14, because -14 is fairly quiet. So you want to basically find this middle ground where you're able to have a very loud mix that's going to work for the DJs, that's going to work for radio and the other platforms you're servicing your record to, but at the same time, you know how it's going to translate when it hits Spotify and other streaming services at -14. So let's talk about how we're actually going to measure this and set this up. So I got my session here. This is a song, Load Management. It just came out. It's by Everything Ocean. And I mastered this record. I did a stem mastering on this record. And that basically involved me working with their a cappella, their vocal effects, and their instrumental, and then balancing the three of them and applying mastering at the top level as well as on the individual track level, just to get it really punchy, full, loud, all that stuff. Now I'm using this plugin here, and I've shown you this in another tutorial. It's called the Ulean Loudness Meter 2. It's the free version. There's a paid version, but the free version does just fine. And you can see here it's showing us our LUFS, our short-term and our integrated LUFS, right? Now when I play this, if I just maybe skip to like a really action-packed moment, I can play this and we can kind of look at what level we're hitting here.
If I dip quick, have fun with it, ayy. If I dip quick, have fun with it, ayy. Get your little story, better run with it, ayy. Get your little story, better run with it, ayy. If I dip quick, have fun with it, ayy. If I dip quick, have fun with it, ayy. Get your little story, better run with it, ayy. Get your little story, better run with it, ayy. Told y'all that I need my chest with a dip.
I'll pause it there for a second. You don't need to hear the whole thing to kind of see what's happening. You saw that when there's really just the vocal, it's a little bit lower. So there's no drums, I should say. It's a little bit lower in volume. LUFS is hovering somewhere around -14, which is cool. That's roughly what it's going to sound like on a streaming platform, right? But of course, once the drums, once the 808 and all that stuff kind of comes into the fold, then we're hitting a much higher level and you're seeing us get closer to that -9 LUFS. So we're past -14, we're louder than -14, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because again, if we were to have something at -14, it's going to be very quiet, and it might work for streaming and Spotify and all that stuff, but it may not work for the other people that we're trying to send this record to. So again, you want to find this best of both worlds situation. So basically, knowing that we're hitting -9 LUFS, we know that Spotify and the other streaming services are going to reduce the volume of this track and bring it down to roughly -14. And again, that's not a bad thing. We're trying to, make sure that this is going to translate onto streaming services, but we want to make sure that we're going to give something good to the other people that we're trying to get this record to. I'm hitting -9, and you may be wondering, well, how am I going to find out what this will sound like when it does hit streaming services, right? If I know they're going to turn it down to -14 and I'm currently at -9, what should I do? What I like to do is I actually like to put some sort of clip gain plugin. You can even use just, a basic EQ or compressor that just has a gain function. You don't want to do anything with it. You don't want to change the sound. And that's why I usually like using the EQ. And I usually play with the output of this EQ, right? So I'm using the stock Pro Tools one here. You can use anything, a Pro Q, utility, gain, trim, anything like that. You can use these plugins, but you really just want to manipulate the overall volume. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this again, and I'm going to look for that loud part where the peaks are, and I'm going to see what happens, how much I have to turn this down to basically have that part hit -14. And this is going to give me a rough idea of what this is going to sound like, because Spotify and the streaming services are essentially going to turn down the volume in this case. So I'm really just doing it for them right now to hear what it's going to sound like when it hits that platform. So let's kind of do this. I'll play and we'll watch, and we'll try to get a level of -14 here when the loud parts are happening.
If I dip quick, have fun with it, ayy. If I dip quick, have fun with it, ayy. Get your little story, better run with it, ayy. Get your little story, better run with it, ayy. If I dip quick, have fun with it, ayy. If I dip quick, have fun with it, ayy. Get your little story, better run with it, ayy. Get your little story, better run with it, ayy. Told y'all that I need my chips with a dip. Yeah, I got my chips now. Think it's time to dip. Shawty looking sexy, now she won't strip. I ain't talking stories, I ain't writing these scripts. Shawty wanna.
So roughly 5 dB. I turned it down by 5 dB, and you can see we're really hovering a lot closer to that -14 range on average. Now, this is not foolproof. It's not perfect. It's probably not going to sound exactly the same, but it's just giving me a little bit of an idea of what it's going to sound like when it hits that platform. And if I hear anything at this stage, right, like maybe I'm going to hear something disappear. Maybe the vocals just could be louder or more present. Maybe the kick drum could be more or less present, the bass, etc. Any problems that really poke its head out at this level, at this stage, I can now address them and have a better idea of what this is going to sound like when it hits those platforms. So if I want, I could just play this and we can A/B to see what this is going to sound like when it hits Spotify and when it's not on Spotify, when I'm giving it to a DJ or somebody else. So this will be what I'd be giving to a DJ.
If I dip quick, have fun with it, ayy. If I dip quick, have fun with it, ayy. Get your little story, better run with it, ayy. Get your little story, better run with it, ayy. If I dip quick, have fun with it, ayy. If I dip quick, have fun with it, ayy. Get Get your little story, better run with it, ayy. Get your little story, better run with it, ayy. Told y'all that I need my chips with a dip. Yeah, I got my chips now, I think it's time to dip. Shawty looking sexy, now she won't strip. I ain't talking stories, I ain't writing these scripts. Shawty wanna ask me a whole lot of questions. I am.
And then obviously when I put that plugin in, you could hear the volume really came down, and that's what it would sound like on a streaming platform. And it might sound significantly quieter in this context, but obviously when we're listening to another song and we're just transitioning into this one and then another one and they're all the same volume, which is basically what Spotify is doing, it's not going to be as noticeable. It's going to sound a lot more natural and fluid. Now, just as a side note, because you may be wondering, where should I be putting this loudness meter on my chain? All of this was on my mastering chain, and this U-Lean loudness meter was specifically the very last thing. After all my mastering, my compression, my limiting, all that stuff, my loudness meter was the absolute last thing that this passes through so I could see what level the overall track is at. And then, of course, I'm going to put my EQ, just my EQ to hear what this is going to sound like when I turn it down, or whatever I'm using to turn it down gain-wise. I'm using this right before it. So the EQ is technically before the meter, but when I bounce this, when I'm finalizing this track, I'm obviously going to, either make both of these inactive or get rid of them and bounce just what you hear with my master. I'm simply doing this just as a reference point to hear what everything is going to sound like once it hits the streaming platform, and I'm trying to do it in a way that doesn't mess up everything I've done up until this point on the mixing and mastering front. And there you have it. These are just some ideas you should keep in mind when you're mixing for streaming platforms. You just want to understand how it's going to sound when it hits the platform to your end listener. If you got value out of this tutorial, please like, subscribe, and share it. Share it with your friends, producer friends, artist friends, engineer friends, people you know who are making music that is going to ultimately hit Spotify, Apple Music, and other streaming platforms that most people listen to music on today. I hope this helped, and I'll see you guys again soon. Peace out.
5